Lisa, Bildy represents a number of churches and people who want to fully open their doors again without restrictions. Lisa, it has been reported that Pastor James Coates of GraceLife Church has been released from jail. That's big news. Would you say that this is an issue of religious freedom, or is it a human rights issue?
Well, it's a human rights issue more broadly. I mean, our organization defends the charter rights of Canadians, and of course, freedom of religion is one of those. Freedom of association, freedom of peaceful assembly are others, and all of them are really implicated by these various restrictions on the ability to gather for any purpose, but certainly for religious gatherings.
And how do you balance the laws put in place for health and safety during this pandemic with human rights and freedoms?
Well, that's been the real big question, because obviously civil liberties, if they're going to be infringed by our government, it has to be done in a manner only, and it's like very limited, but only where it can be demonstrably justified that it's necessary and reasonable and a minimal impairment of our rights. And so that's a pretty high onus, and the government has to meet that. But in the case of a pandemic, where they're arguing that they have to put these restrictions in place, a lot of people believe that any limits are justified. So where the line is the million-dollar question. And until courts start ruling on the constitutional question more fully, it's still hard to know where that line is.
And what are the people in the churches you're representing telling you?
Well, they're telling me that they view themselves as absolutely essential, because this has been going on for a year. And certainly while, in the beginning days of the pandemic and even in the earlier months, they were certainly willing and prepared to go along with whatever restrictions were put in place. As time went on and we got more information about the virus and knew more about who it was impacting the most and how we could protect ourselves from it, they began to feel that the restrictions were very oppressive and arbitrary, because in a lot of jurisdictions across the country, the churches have been particularly singled out for more draconian lockdowns. They haven't been treated as essential at all. Now, that's not the case in every jurisdiction, but certainly in some. So they're of the view that they are essential. They provide hope in a time when people are struggling. And as the lockdown harms mount, because remember, it's not just the virus that is causing harm anymore. We've been at this so long now that we're starting to see a lot of other impacts and secondary consequences, which in the long run may outweigh what consequences there were from the pandemic itself. And as they're sort of on the front lines of dealing with people every day, they recognize that people need hope right now, and they need to come together in their worship communities. So that's what they're telling me.
Coming up later on the show, Lisa, we have another pastor, who says the Bible requires Christians to adhere to the law of the land. Is there anything on the other side of this highly divisive issue that you would agree with?
Well, that's a theological interpretation, and I'm not equipped to deal with that question. I know that some of the pastors that we represent have a different view on that particular question. They are of the view that they are to follow their biblical call to have corporate worship. So, and while you follow the government on matters that are in the government's purview, whether the government should be restricting churches is not something that they believe is within their purview.
How about also caring for our neighbors? And even if that means that we have to shut down our churches, we're protecting ourselves from being able to contract this virus and be able to pass it on to others. What are the thoughts of churches when it comes to that, and just being a good neighbor in their community and making sure there isn't transmission of the virus?
Well, I don't think anybody has taken the position that we should just let it rip and not be concerned about our neighbors. But caring for our neighbors, and these are not really legal issues, so my clients would be better equipped to speak to these questions. But caring for our neighbors is also looking after their emotional, psychological, and religious needs too. So they're not opening the door to let everybody in, hundreds, 900 people at a time. They are certainly putting parameters in place so that nobody who comes in is sick or carrying the virus, and they distance people, they space them out in the church and so on. So it's not that that they're completely lacking in appreciation for the fact that there's a virus going around, but they think that the measures are too restrictive, too heavy-handed, and given what we now know about the virus, that it is not the unusually deadly killer that we thought it was a year ago, it's time for it to be for a new perspective on the whole matter.
Yeah, I think some people would disagree with that statement about it not being a killer because there are millions of people who've died. But last question, how?
Well, I didn't say it wasn't, just a minute, I didn't say it wasn't a killer. I just said that it wasn't what we had feared a year ago. So we know a lot more about it now, so we can protect ourselves a lot better.
Last question. So how do you think this will play out in the courts?
Well, we're starting to find out. We had a case in BC just last week that was a decision was rendered that was actually not that favorable to us. The judge there ruled that the restrictions that the public health officer had put in place were within the realm of reasonable. It didn't get into the charter questions quite the way that we're hoping to in the decisions that we're looking for in Ontario. The regime is different. It's a public health officer making all the decisions out there. But it is telling that the courts do seem to be giving the governments a fairly wide berth on this, and so we do have a tough battle ahead of us. But that's par for the course.
All right, thank you, Lisa Bildy, for your time. Again, lawyer from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom. Thank you.
You're welcome.